Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What Effective Employee Engagement Looks Like in Local Government. My name is Natalie Varanya, and I am the Marketing Specialist here at TalentMap, and I will be your webinar host today. For today's presenter, we have David Ang with us on the line. David Ang is TalentMap's Vice President of Employee Engagement and Consulting. He is a seasoned market research professional and management consultant. He brings over 25 years of consulting experience to help TalentMap's clients better understand their workforce and improve employee engagement. Over the years, David has worked with a range of clients from the private sector to nonprofit and government organizations. His extensive research and consulting background has enriched his abilities in building effective client survey strategies, questionnaire design, focus groups, and workshop facilitation, as well as executive presentations. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Now for today's agenda, once I'm done with all the formal introductions, David will start us off with why we're focusing on employee engagement specific to local governments for this webinar, and then he'll dive into a few statistics on what employee engagement looks like in governments in both Canada and the United States. And then to close off the discussion, he'll look at strategies to help attract, retain, and engage public sector employees. And then we will also reserve the last 20 minutes for some Q&A. And then so before we jump right in, for those who are not familiar with TalentMap, I wanted to give a quick overview of who we are and what we do. TalentMap is a trusted advisor in employee engagement and surveying. We've been in business for over 18 years, and in those years, we have conducted more than 7,000 employee engagement survey projects. Each year, we survey over 1 million employees across more than 500 organizations. At TalentMap, we have one focus, and that's to partner with organizations to improve their workplaces. So we do this using three core elements. First, we ensure you ask the right questions, whether you're launching a full employee engagement survey, a pulse survey, entry-exit surveys, or a 360 feedback survey. Secondly, we uncover valuable employee insights by diving deep into the data and really analyzing your results. And lastly, what makes TalentMap truly unique among our sea of competitors is that we stick it out and we make sure you act on your survey results to make real change in your workforce through effective action planning and additional post-survey consulting services. And then as you can see from the slide right now, we've worked with a number of local government and public sector clients across North America. With our years of experience, we have established comprehensive industry benchmarks to put our clients' survey results in the context of their competitive marketplace. So now that you know a bit more about TalentMap, we'll get started. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Natalie. So to start the discussion or the presentation, why this topic today? And in a word, it's because it's an important topic. So local government or municipalities, they impact all of us directly. It's the communities we live in, it's the communities we work in, it's where our kids go to school. But of all levels of government, local government, I think, has the most, direct and day-to-day impact on our lives. So it's important to know what you as HR professionals and so on in local government can do to drive engagement among your employees who work in your organization. So that's why we're covering that topic today. Before we actually get into, a discussion around, details around engagement in local government and what can be done to further drive engagement, I'd like to start with a very quick overview of, what is employee engagement. I think it's important that we have a common understanding of what it is we're actually going to be talking about and why it's important to focus on employee engagement. So there's lots of different definitions of employee engagement that you can find on the internet through HR organizations and so on. And we at TalentMap have come up with a definition we think makes a lot of sense and has been validated through research and years of study. So really our model on engagement is built on the rational side of work, the emotional side of work, which leads to behavior change. And really the output of a highly engaged employee is a different type of behavior from those that are not engaged or disengaged. And the key to this is that different behavior is discretionary. It's not forced, it's not requested by management or supervisors. It's not done with a motive of, for example, more compensation. It's done because the employee wants to do it. And that's important. So that's what we're going to be talking about. How do you get employees to that state of discretionary behavior? And I'll talk about this in more detail shortly, but the majority of the drivers of engagement, what causes engagement, really are emotional. This contrasts quite sharply with job satisfaction, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is driven primarily by more transactional things, such as compensation, your office environment, the tools of the trade, communications, those sorts of things. Those are more job satisfaction driven. Engagement is typically driven more by the emotional appeal of the job, things like pride in the organization, and you're inspired by the work that you do, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So why is engagement important in government? This is a very simple exhibit, as you can see. So really, there's evidence that shows that highly engaged employees in government tend to have or drive higher levels of citizen or client satisfaction. And what this results in down the road is a higher level of trust and confidence in among the citizenry and the public in terms of the services that you as local government and government in general offer. And that's important for many reasons, from support for funding, support for programs, and so on and so forth. If the citizenry has more trust and confidence, these things will play out in a positive fashion for you. I found a nice quote that I like about engagement. So engaged employees plan to stay for what they give. Disengaged employees stay for what they get. And I think that provides a nice contrast in terms of engagement versus satisfaction. So I talked about evidence of positive employee engagement, and I'm just going to put a few numbers up here just to entrench why we believe highly engaged local government is something to strive for. So fully engaged public sector employees are twice as likely to stay in their current job. So given the challenges around attraction and retention, not only in the public service, but in general with the demographic changes that we're seeing, that's very important if you can retain employees. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go through the presentation. Engaged public employees are 2.5 times more likely to feel they can make a difference. That's very important. That's the emotional connection that we talk about. And from a lot of the work that I've done with public sector clients in the past year, looking at comments and focus groups and so on that employees themselves provide, this is a really, really key attraction for employees in the public service, including local government, is that they feel that they're making a difference, that they're contributing to the public good, to society. That's a big reason that they are in public service in the first place. 2.5 times more likely to recommend workplace to others. Again, that's going to help you in terms of attracting new talent to the organization. 3 times as likely to be very satisfied in their jobs. And we know that if they're satisfied in their jobs, they are going to offer better service to the public and to the citizens that they're there to serve. Another study, on average, public sector work units with high employee engagement score 11 points higher in service than those with low engagement. So again, higher engagement leads to higher satisfied clients. And finally, a different study shows that highly engaged employees are significantly more productive as well. So there's lots of good reasons to strive for engagement in local government and in government in general. And now what we're going to do is we're going to try to break that down and see how we can actually help you to move engagement in your organization. So let's start by looking at engagement in government. What does it look like? So a good starting point is to understand how engaged are employees in local government vis-a-vis organizations in other industries. Are you where you need to be, relatively speaking? So what you're seeing here are the proportion of employees across different sectors or different types of organizations that are engaged. And you can see that local government and municipal employees, and this is from our Talent Map benchmark database that we have, and Natalie mentioned that we do literally thousands and thousands of studies, and we've collected a very, very extensive database over the years, and we're able to identify different levels of engagement for different industry sectors. And we can see that local government municipalities are at 69% based on our data that would be classified as engaged. And that's towards the bottom in relation to other types of organizations. For example, not-for-profit and smaller organizations, small companies, which are 250 employees or less, are at 75% engagement levels. And so at 69%, that's, I don't want to understate it. That's not a terrible number, but there's obviously room to grow. And if you look at best in class, in terms of top 10%, that number, local government number, is lagging even more. So that gives us a sense of, in general, where local government stands in terms of engagement. Not great, but not too bad, but certainly room for improvement. So what exactly is driving engagement within government, among government employees? A couple of different models here. The one on the left is from the International Public Management Association for Human Resources, which some of you may be familiar with. And you can see here that based on their study, about half of government employees are what they would classify as fully engaged. A little bit lower than the number I just presented from the Talent Map database, but the reason for that discrepancy is we're using different scales and a little bit of a different model to capture engagement. But the more important point here is that if you look at the drivers of that engaged workforce, and these are the top 6 drivers that they've identified: sense of accomplishment, serving the public, making a difference, pride in the work, value, goals. What you'll see very quickly is that they're all more closely tied to the emotional aspect of work that I talked about earlier. These are not transactional things like, when am I being paid, or do I have a great benefit plan? None of those types of things are key drivers of engagement for those in the public sector. If you look at the Talent Map top drivers of engagement, and this is again based on the thousands of studies that we've done, we can see again that the list of top drivers are not transactional. Again, they revolve around what the employee can do to develop themselves and contribute to the organization and to their clients. So things like professional growth, what's the vision of the organization, leadership in terms of, where's leadership driving this organization, teamwork, the relationships that they have with their colleagues and peers, and innovation. A study from Marcus Buckingham Company shows the study was done in 13 countries around the world, and the consistent thing that came out is the chance to use my strengths every day at work, which is very similar to sense of accomplishment in the other study or professional growth in our studies, was the one factor that came out as the top driver in all 13 countries. So again, we can see that what's going to drive engagement the most are not necessarily the things that would first come to mind, like pay them more. So moving forward, when we look at strategies to drive engagement among employees in local government, we want to keep these types of constructs in mind, as they have the biggest impact on driving engagement. So let's look at local government specifically. We think that there are some very unique engagement challenges or differences that you face in local or municipal government relative to certainly the private sector, and even perhaps in comparison to federal governments or very large government. So the first thing is local government tends to have a very diverse, and I don't mean diverse in terms of race and gender and so on, which we'll talk about later, but diverse in terms of the types of things that you do, which results in different types of employees, and also the fact that you're in multiple locations within the city, depending on the type of service you're offering. Cities typically offer, from administrative work to libraries, parks and recreation, EMS, fire services, police, transportation, environmental management, garbage collection. I mean, it's so varied, and you'll have different locations, different types of facilities, different types of employees. That has a big impact on how you manage engagement and how you measure and manage engagement as well, and we'll look at that. Due to the nature of the work that I just talked about, the different types of services that you offer, which are very, very unique, it's only normal that silos happen or exist in local government. And we'll look at that as well. Compared to most, for example, private sector, let's say a financial services firm or an IT firm, the scope of services that local government offers is 10, 20-fold. You're not specialized, focused on a certain area. And because of that, there's less collaboration between those lines of services. And you have to break down silos in terms of driving engagement organizationally. A very, very unique challenge that you face is city council. This is something that most organizations don't have to deal with. And I would suggest that the smaller the township or the government or the city that you're working in, the more this becomes a challenge in terms of city council wanting or potentially wanting to be involved in how things are run within your municipality or local government. And finally, another interesting one, political pressure and anonymity. And what I mean by this is, and it's much more acute in small organizations or small townships, is that in a small community, everybody knows everybody. So if you are employed by the local government and you're working in a very small community, there may be pressure for something as simple as snow clearing in the winter or road repairs, that because I know you as John Doe or Jane Doe work in that department, when you're at the grocery store, you may get stopped and asked, why isn't this being done? Why isn't my garbage being picked up on time, et cetera, et cetera. And that puts a lot of pressure on the employee. Happens a lot less or not at all in very large communities, for example, in Toronto or Vancouver, for example. That situation likely will never occur. But in small communities, that would certainly be a consideration for an employee, which could ultimately impact engagement. So let's look at that first unique challenge that you face as local government. And that has to do with the variety of employees that you have. And because of that, you're going to require you can't have a single strategy to deal with engagement. As I mentioned earlier, the range of services are so broad in terms of the types of people. So public transit, finance, So you have parks and recreation, environmental management, administration. So, what that means is, and you'll know this better than anyone, the types of employees that you have are not homogeneous. You'll have people who have advanced degrees in your legal department, for example, or engineering, down to those that are, have a lower level of completed education, for the different types of jobs that exist. They'll be located in different settings, some in office towers or buildings, in a professional setting, and others in garages or workshops, depots. So how do you manage all of the different levels of employees that you have with a single engagement strategy? That becomes very difficult. This has been a problem that for example, a law firm or an IT firm would have to deal with, because the variance in the type of employee is not nearly as diverse as it is for local government. So that presents several challenges in terms of how you're going to measure engagement and drive engagement in the organization. So one of the things that we would ask that you consider, or recommend that you consider, is around, when you're measuring engagement, is around the accessibility of provided to employees to contribute their opinions and their feedback on engagement issues. And again, it's challenging for you because you have a multifaceted approach that you have to take. Many of you will have unionized, partly or heavily unionized components of your workforce, and while it's not essential that unions be on board for the survey, it's highly recommended, because participation rates and how employees' answer surveys will be heavily impacted by the stance taken by their unions. So it's important to work with unions to get them on side with any engagement initiatives. Another aspect is around the platform for surveying. So if you're going to go out and engage and ask for opinions from employees in your workforce, given that it's so diverse in terms of the educational level, in terms of location, in terms of access to technology, you have to offer multiple platforms. Just saying we're going to do an email survey, we have found, is not an effective and optimal way to reach out on those kinds of consultations. So you would have to typically have a multi-survey collection approach as opposed to a singular one. It's more complex, it's more costly, could take longer, and those considerations need to be made. You have to take into account the literacy levels, as I mentioned. So the survey itself, the questionnaire itself, needs to be designed using a language that can be understood by all of your employees, not just those with advanced graduate degrees, for example. So use of simple language. Many of you would probably also have diversity and inclusion programs in place. Governments are often leading edge on, in this area, and as such, the English language may not be first language for a lot of your employees. So again, that needs to be taken into account when designing the questionnaire. So in terms of implementation, there's several approaches that have been proven to be effective that we've seen over the years. Rather than just having email distribution, you can set up things like kiosks in the coffee room or lunch rooms. You can have pre-appointed survey stations, so blocked off times, between, let's say, 1 and 3 in the afternoon, that this particular group of employees can come in and complete the survey, at a specific location, and there's workstations or iPads set up to do that. Paper, if necessary, but not necessarily paper. So in today's environmentally conscious environment, not to use the pun, we try to minimize paper as much as possible, but paper is sometimes the best option for a variety of reasons. If there are employees in remote locations with technology connection issues or challenges, for older employees that are not as comfortable contributing their opinions online. I mean, there's lots of reasons to do paper, so it's something that should be looked at as well. So all of that is around how you would measure effectively in terms of engagement, the engagement process. But in terms of managing the engagement process, trust and confidentiality is incredibly important. Sorry about that. You're all probably aware and of the opinion that pre-survey communications is important. What we'd recommend is whatever you're thinking, double it. It needs to be, especially if it's the first time you're doing something like this, you would need to really emphasize that employees will not face retribution, that they will not, no personal opinion is going to be attributed back to them, that they can have confidence that the opinions that they share are going to be held in confidence and treated respectfully. Communicate. So not just a single email or a memo that goes out saying we're going to do this. Hold webinars, for example. And again, back to the literacy comments that we talked about earlier, ensure that it's done in a very simple and plain to use language. Provide as much information as you can on timing, on content, on how their opinions are going to be actioned on the back end, so that people know that their opinions count. And finally, Survey Champions is a tool that we've found to be very, very effective. So within each of the different departments that you have, Parks and Recreation, police services, library services, so on, appoint a survey champion in each of these areas, someone who can vouch for the importance of the survey, of the confirm that and reassure their colleagues and their teams that their feedback is going to remain confidential. So Survey Champions is also, a very effective and proven technique in terms of driving participation rates in engagement surveys. So even though you do have challenges based on the diversity of your employee base and the variety in your employee base, there are different approaches that can be taken to maximize participation and response rates. The key, though, as well, is on the back end to demonstrate that action will be taken and that their opinions count. We talked about silos in government. Again, the reason this is a big issue is because local governments are typically organized by the type of service provided to the public. So the environmental management division that takes care of things like recycling and garbage collection and so on would probably have very little or nothing to do with, for example, police services or corporate services like finance and legal at head office. So what happens is, a lot of the decisions and a lot of the experiences of the employees are isolated to their own department or division, and they tend to be managed independently. And of course, resourcing is a key challenge that not only local government faces, but realistically, virtually all organizations face. But it's often viewed as a zero-sum game. If we're going to put more money into policing in the community, well, that has to come out of somebody's budget because it's not a limitless pool of money. So it creates competition for that dollar, and that's not always necessarily a good thing for employee engagement, because it's one department's gain is another department's loss. So you have to manage these silos, to drive corporate engagement. So what can you do in terms of the silo issue that we've just talked about? The first and biggest thing that we would recommend is to take the perspective that employee engagement is a citywide or local government-wide initiative. It's not an initiative unique to one department or another. It has to be viewed holistically, organizationally. So in terms of what does that mean practically? So when this is rolled out, roll it out organizationally. When results are shared, once the surveys are done and the data is collected, ensure that the results are presented out organizationally first, before individual departments or managers receive their own information. That way it sets the tone that corporately for the city of X, these are what you as employees feel. Very importantly, it's always key to develop action plans around the findings of any engagement survey. But what you don't want to do is go out, and I'm jumping to the bottom, what you don't want to do is go out and start developing action plans that are department-based. Well, you want to start with organization-wide drivers. So identified previously, 5-10 minutes ago, what are the key drivers of government? And it was, things like professional growth and vision and so on. So those are the ones that you want to focus on, because they impact employees across the organization. So if it's something like professional growth opportunities, whether you're in the police forces or whether you're in library services or whether you're in parks and recreation, employees typically want to understand how they can grow, how they can develop their career within whichever division. So they're organization-wide initiatives that can be taken. So those are the ones you need to focus on, as opposed to more transactional, divisional challenges or departmental challenges like bad communication, which may be an issue in one department but not another. That being said, you do want to provide the individual departments the ability to go out and address individual issues as well that's within their own departments. So for example, communications. If the Parks and Recreation Department has a communications issue, it doesn't mean that they can't or shouldn't address that issue and develop a plan around it. But it should be consistent and it should be complementary to the organizational citywide plans that are being developed as well. Another way to drive better collaboration is to create employee engagement working groups. And these working groups should be cross-department, cross-functional, so that people can talk to each other across departments, because even though police forces and environmental services may not really have much in common in terms of their day-to-day work, they may have the similar types of challenges in terms of, for example, teamwork issues or approaches to innovation. And there could be best practices and learnings that could be shared. And it also promotes more discussions and more conversations between departments, which will help break down the silos. So even though by definition, a lot of what you do in local government is very specialized, there are still a lot of opportunities from an engagement perspective to work organizationally and excuse the cliche term, but horizontally, cross departments, cross-functionally, to drive engagement. Let's look at managing council quickly. So this one is a very, very unique challenge to local government. And really, this is going to be very individualized to the community or in. In some communities, councils are very active and have a big interest in employee engagement. Sometimes for good reasons, for positive reasons, because they want to ensure that that the organization is functioning as efficiently and as productively as possible, and that they have happy employees. On other occasions, not always with the best intentions. They may be trying to influence political agendas and so on and so forth. So it can be a challenge, not always, but it certainly can. And council may, deem that they have to be involved in designing, reporting, and managing employee engagement initiatives, and that really is something that shouldn't happen. And we need to work to ensure that engagement initiatives, especially measurement, and then the management on the back end, are not politically influenced, or else it defeats the entire purpose of employee engagement. And I can tell you from speaking with employees and reading comments they provide in verbatim comments and so on in surveys, many employees understand and actually do get frustrated with what they view as political interference in their ability to do the job. So this, we need to be cognizant of this moving forward in terms of measuring engagement. But what can you do realistically? Because council are the political masters of the organization. If council shows an interest in engagement, I think one of the key things that you can do is to keep them informed of the process. What you plan to do, why you're doing it, what you plan to achieve, and how it's going to be used to improve the organization. Very, very important and very effective way to keep council involved if they're interested, but also to manage their expectations is to have your third-party vendor or survey provider or consultant be involved in those discussions with council. So certainly in terms of providing perspective and objective and independent perspective on design issues, questions that can and cannot be asked for a variety of reasons. But on the back end, in terms of presenting results, the external party can and should offer the results with no agenda attached, not sugar-coated, and provide an independent perspective that's not shaded by either the employees, management, or politicians. So it's very important, I think, that if you progress to engagement, or if you do engagement internally and there is interest from council, that you heavily involve your research vendor, your survey vendor in the process. Final comment on one of the unique challenges faced by local government. It's around political pressure that employees face, and really this is, as I mentioned earlier on, specific to smaller communities. Everyone knows everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows what everyone's doing. I live in a small community just outside of Ottawa, and in the small community I live in, that's certainly true. Everybody does know everybody, and for good or for bad, people sort of know everyone's business as well. And that can have a stressful impact on employees as they go about their daily lives. They get pressured to do things, or they have counselors, for example, come right up to them and say, I know you're in the roads division. I need you to work on this. It may be against regulation. It may be inappropriate, but it does happen. So there's political pressure, not just from politicians, but from the public at large, because they know they've gone to school with these people. They might, you might socialize with them and so on. I'll talk about, how we can potentially turn this into an advantage when we're talking about recruitment in a couple of slides. So the one thing I haven't talked about, which is, and you may or may not be thinking this, but it does come up, is what about compensation? Can't we just, pay our way out of, or pay our way to higher engagement and satisfaction? If you remember earlier on, the more transactional side of the business that leads to job satisfaction but not engagement. One of the key things there is compensation. So what about compensation? Well, there's a disparity in compensation levels. So in large municipalities, like Toronto, for example, you're competing against the private sector. Hard to compete on compensation over there. In smaller communities, and especially for, when you're talking mid to senior level staff, if you're in a smaller community, you can easily get coached by a bigger, municipality or local government somewhere else, because there are talent shortages. We all know that the retirement cycle with boomers retiring in large numbers, there are opportunities. So it's hard to compete on compensation. The other aspect around compensation is, I don't work in local government, but I see it in the news all the time. When there's budget pressures, what do they do? One of the first things is, let's cut staff, pay freezes, and these are brought about by, we talked about zero-sum game in terms of budgets can only increase so much each year because most municipal and local governments, set caps on how much they'll increase property taxes or raise fees and so on, to 2 to 3% or whatever it may be. And, it's politically popular, to bring the hammer down on budgets in local government. So it's very, very hard to compete on compensation. The good news is compensation isn't a key driver of engagement. So the chart you see there is one that we do in all of our studies where we essentially plot all the different drivers of engagement. And you can see here, this is a very typical finding on the driver analysis that we do, that compensation, while it's not really rated very well by most employees in the public sector, it's one of the more poorly rated aspects of work. It's also one of the least important drivers in terms of importance, in terms of contribution to overall engagement. And so we almost always see it in that bottom left quadrant. Really, and as you go left to right, that's the importance of the work dimension in terms of contribution to engagement. And you can see that it's typically not a strong driver of engagement. Also, that's not unique to the public sector or to government employees. Even in a lot of private sector work that we do, compensation is weighted relatively poorly. People always feel that they should be paid more, typically, or compensated more than they are, irrespective of where they are. So that's not a unique thing. Another study done by Work Life Design shows that only 30%, 34%, about a third of employees named compensation as a key driver. 80% said work environment was the main factor in engagement. What is work environment? It's servant leadership, trust and cooperation, work-life balance, credible management. So again, compensation is something that often people will, and maybe not those of you who are on this call because you're HR specialists and so on, but those that have a sort of a visceral reaction to what can we do, let's pay them more. That's not the answer. There are other approaches, I think, that are far more effective to drive engagement in the organization. So let's look at that, and this will be the last section before we take some questions. So what are some strategies to attract, retain, and engage employees? Again, there's multiple studies out there. There's lots of different things that have been done by different organizations in different countries. In the UK, they've focused on leadership and leadership development and so on. What I'm going to present here is based on a study that was done, focusing on small rural municipalities and what can be done to attract, retain, and engage employees. So let's start with the work environment, which on the previous slide, a couple of slides ago, I mentioned that 80% of public sector employees identified work environment as one of the key drivers of engagement. So the work environment, what is the work environment? So really, it is employee engagement. It's things that engage the employee. So let's start with listening, feedback, and action. So that's what we talked about earlier, measuring and managing engagement. So that is a key strategy to drive engagement. Is first of all, to measure it, to know where you stand, and then to manage that process to drive engagement further. Many of you are already doing that, which is a great first step. So what are some of the other things that you'd want to consider as you go through the engagement cycle? Employees often talk about the desire for them to be able to contribute and provide input and feedback, especially into the things that affect their day-to-day jobs and their lives. So we call that inclusive management. So talk to your staff before you implement the policy. The old school top-down, do as I tell you approach to management, I think is no longer viewed well. It's not effective, and it certainly harms engagement. Transparency of information and communication. Employees want to know that what they're being told and what they're being communicated to is not being sugarcoated. It's not it's not being massaged. That it's the real truth of the matter. So we shouldn't be trying to hide information, and this becomes a bigger challenge for you because in siloed organizations, it's much harder to disseminate that and communicate that information consistently and evenly across the different types of organizations that exist within local government. Not only because of the different types of technology that may or may not be used. For example, sending an email may not be the most effective manner, but also because of the types of work, the levels of literacy, and all the diversity of employees that you have. A lot of thought needs to be put into how information is communicated and flowed through the organization. Reward and recognition for performance, that's not unique to local government, but employees do want to feel recognized for a job well done and for the efforts that they put in. I'm not saying that you have to pay them more or give them a big bonus, but simple thank you, or a note, in the weekly newsletter, recognizing star performers. Those kinds of things go a long way. Finally, leadership development is very important. It's one thing to measure engagement and where engagement has been and where you want it to go. But if you look at what's a key driver of engagement, senior leadership, vision, often come out very, very high, if not at the top. And so you need to train people on how to be good leaders. It's not something that everyone will get naturally, and these are concepts and ideas that can be developed over time. And development programs that are put in place that help people become leaders is important. Tools like a 360 feedback survey or program, very, very useful, very important. Not only gives leaders feedback on what they're doing and insight into what what their employees think of them and ways to improve, but it also demonstrates to the employees that the organization takes their opinion seriously with respect to leadership, that they can actually provide direct feedback on how they're being managed. Employer branding is an interesting one, and this relates really to mostly to attracting new employees, which is a challenge, I think, for local governments in particular, given that we talked about the fact that you're competing against many others. But really, branding is around, it's not dissimilar to corporate branding. You want to be an employer of choice. And one of the key ways to do that is through the millennials and Gen Zs coming up now, or the newer entrants into the workforce, targeting what appeals to them. In a small city, for example, they're going to have more influence in policy and decision making. And that balances that political pressure issue that we talked about. Yes, people ask me to do things, but hey, now because we're in a small organization, I actually will have more input and influence. Greater sense of purpose and community involvement in government. Typically in local government, you have good work-life balance and lifestyle considerations, and talk about growth and development opportunities. So essentially appeal to the needs and the wants of the newer employees coming into the workforce, and make that your brand. Development and diversity and inclusion plan. This is something that's becoming increasingly important everywhere, including government. And I have to say government is often a leader in this area. But make sure that you have a diversity and inclusion plan. Not only does it show leadership in society and so on, and it allows you to tap into a much larger labor pool of immigrants. And I know in Canada we get about 250,000 immigrants each year, a lot with very, very good skill sets that you can tap into, persons with disabilities, First Nations. So there's a lot of good reasons to develop a diversity and inclusion plan. And it's society-wide, it's also expected, and as government, it shows leadership. And finally, succession planning, and this is tied to professional growth as well as leadership that we talked about as key drivers earlier on. It provides the opportunity for employees to see very clearly that the organization takes this seriously, and that they have a career path within the organization, that if they do the right things, that there is opportunity to move up and develop their skill sets and competencies and move forward. Things like coaching and mentorships, job shadowing, these are tactical programs that can be put in place to ensure that succession planning takes place. So just to wrap up, last 5 minutes. So local governments, municipalities, especially smaller ones, you face very unique employee engagement challenges, both in terms of attracting new employees, given the competition for jobs, as well as retaining them and maintaining a high level of engagement. We talked about what some of those challenges are, from the diverse workforce to silos to political pressures that you face. Some strategies that you should consider that have been shown to be successful. Don't fall into what we would call the competition trap. Compensation is not a key driver of engagement. You need to be competitive, but you need to also promote all the other very positive aspects that you as local government can bring to the table. Make engagement a priority, measure and manage it. That includes leadership development. As I mentioned, that's being done by many governments around the world in terms of leadership development. Turn your brand into a strength. You do have a lot to offer that would appeal to millennials and Gen Zs, and you should use that to your advantage. Diversity and inclusion planning is important, as is succession planning. So on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Natalie for any questions, and then we'll wrap up at 1 o'clock in about 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. Really highlights how complex employee engagement can be in local governments. So because we only have 4 minutes left, I think we've run out of time for questions. But if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact us. Our information will be on the last slide, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. But before we sign off, I do have a couple of things to mention. So Talent Map resources. We've been working very hard here at Talent Map to provide additional resources for our clients and our subscribers. We regularly post new articles on our blog each week that provide quick tips, tricks, and a look at industry trends, as well as some thought leadership pieces to keep you in the loop. We also recently built a resource library where you can find more in-depth content pieces, including downloadable how-to guides, checklists, and info sheets to help guide your employee engagement initiatives. And then as for upcoming Talent Map events and learning sessions, we will be at the Ottawa Business Journal Networking Golf Tournament next Tuesday in Ottawa. And then we'll also be attending NHRMA's 80th Annual Conference and Trade Show in Tacoma, Washington in about 2 weeks, I think now on September 5th to 7th. If you're attending, please stop by booth 509. We'd love to meet you. And then finally, the last two, we are also exhibiting at the OMRA Fall Conference in Alliston, Ontario, and the OMAA Fall Workshop in Muskoka, Ontario. And then, as I mentioned, the last slide, it has my contact information as well as David's contact information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. We'd be happy to open up a conversation if you have additional questions on employee engagement in local governments. And then one final reminder, the recording of the webinar and slide deck will be posted on our website early next week, and we'll be sure to email you directly once it's available. So that is it for our presentation today. Thank you so much, David, for taking the time to present, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you'll join us again. Bye for now.